Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. I am your host, Gabe, and today we're going to be talking about the Battle of Agua Dulce. The Battle of Agua Dulce Creek was a skirmish during the Texas Revolution between Mexican troops and rebellious colonists of the Mexican province of Texas known as Texans. As part of the Goliad campaign to retake the Texas Gulf Coast, Mexican troops ambushed a group of Texans on March 2, 1836. The skirmish began approximately 26 miles south of San Patricio in territory belonging to the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. Determined to quash the rebellion, Santa Anna began assembling a large force to restore order. In late December, at Santa Anna's behest, the Mexican Congress passed the Tornado Decree, declaring that any foreigners fighting against Mexican troops will be deemed as pirates and dealt with as such, being citizens of no nation presently at war with the Republic and fighting under no recognized flag. In the early 19th century, captured pirates were executed immediately. The resolution thus gave the Mexican army permission to take no prisoners in the war against the Texans. Santa Anna personally led the bulk of his troops inland to San Antonio de Bejar and ordered General Jose de Urrea to lead 550 troops along the Atcosito Road towards Goliad. Urrea's efforts to quell the rebellion along the Texas Gulf Coast have become known as the Goliad Campaign. The Texas Provisional Government had named Sam Houston the commander of the new regular army in Texas, but without authority over the volunteers, though they still reported to Johnson. The Provisional Governor, Henry Smith, opposed the Matamoros expedition and ordered Houston to find a way to disband it. In a rousing speech to the volunteers, Houston dissuaded the bulk of the men from continuing their mission. Many left the army after that. Others joined the troops stationed under Houston's second-in-command, James Fannin, at Presidio La Bahia and Goliad. By the end of January 1836, only 70 men remained with Johnson and Grant. Most of these volunteers were Americans or Europeans who had arrived in Texas after fighting had commenced. Urrea reached Matamoros on January 31st. A committed Federalist himself, he soon convinced other Federalists in the area that the Texans' ultimate goal was secession, and their attempt to spark a Federalist revolt in Matamoros was just a method of diverting attention from themselves. Meanwhile, Mexican double agents continued to assure Johnson and Grant that they would be able to take Matamoros easily. Urrea's forces crossed into Texas on February 18th. Despite hearing rumors that the Mexican army was approaching, Grant and Johnson chose to take their men south of the Nueces River, into territory belonging to the state of Tamaulipas. They were to search for horses to buy, steal, and otherwise gather. On about February 21st, Johnson and a small group began herding approximately 100 horses back into Texas. The rest of the men remained with Grant, ostensibly to look for more horses. In actuality, he was attempting to rendezvous with his allies near Matamoros to determine whether Federalists were still willing to rise up against the Mexican army. Mexican troops arrived in San Patricio in the early hours of February 26 after a 19 or 15-minute battle. Johnson's men were defeated. 6 Texans, including Johnson, escaped, and the remainder were killed or captured. While Urrea waited for reinforcements before beginning his march towards Goliad, his advance party searched for Grant and the remaining Texans. Unaware of Johnson's fate, on February 27th, Grant and his party began their march northward to San Patricio, driving a herd of several hundred horses he had purchased. The men camped along San Fernando Creek on March 1st. Local ranchers welcomed them, but that night sent a messenger to Urrea with Grant's location and his plans. Mexican troops marched overnight towards El Puerto de las Huertas del Agua Dulce, a well-known crossing point on Agua Dulce Creek. Approximately 26 miles south of San Patricio and about 1 mile from Banquet and just north of modern-day Kingsville, Mexican soldiers took cover in 2 groves of trees. Urrea had approximately 150 troops, including 80 dragoons. Grant's company comprised about 53 men, including a large contingent of Tejanos under the command of Placido Benavides. The men were in good spirits and rode at an easy pace towards San Patricio. Grant, Benavides, and Reuben Brown rode 5 miles ahead of the main body of Texans and saw no signs of Mexican soldiers. Between 10 and 11 a.m., as the bulk of Texans reached the trees, the Mexican cavalry attacked. Taken completely unaware, many of the Texans were shot before they were able to raise their guns. As they tried to flee, dragoons chased them down and lanced them off their horses. 5 Texans dismounted and made a run for a small village nearby, hoping to gain cover so they could use their rifles. Urrea sent the infantry after them. 2 of those Texans were captured, and the rest escaped. Grant, Benavides, and Brown turned back to join the other Texans. Once in the battle, Brown dismounted, either to reload his rifle or because his horse was killed. Seeing that the battle was lost, Grant pulled Brown onto another horse, and the 2 of them and Benavides turned to flee. Mexican cavalry attempted to stop them. Grant shot one officer, and he and Benavides then galloped past the officer's horse. At this point, the herd stampeded. Forcing the Mexican cavalry aside, the three Texans followed the horses. Mexican soldiers promptly gave chase. According to Brown's later recollection, both his and Grant's horses were wounded as Mexican soldiers fired after them. The three Texans ran for 6 to 7 miles, occasionally firing their pistols to force Mexican dragoons to stay back. Mexican soldiers yelled that the men would be spared if they surrendered, but none of the Texans believed them. Benavides had the strongest mount, and Grant ordered him to go ahead and warn Fannin that the Mexican army was close to Goliad. Grant and Brown were surrounded and forced to stop. Grant killed a Mexican soldier who drove a lance through Brown's arm. Between 10 and 12 Mexican soldiers then surrounded Grant, and he died after being pierced multiple times. Historian Stuart Reed theorizes that the Mexican soldiers were eager to ensure Grant that he would not survive the battle. Grant could identify Federalist sympathizers in Matamoros and the surrounding areas, and his knowledge potentially put Urrea and some of the Federalist sympathizing troops at risk. Brown threw his empty pistol at one Mexican officer, then grabbed the lance from the man Grant had shot and used it to defend himself. After soldiers lassoed him, Brown suffered and was taken captive. Brown was then brought back to the site of the ambush. He recalled that one severely injured Texan, Joseph Carpenter, was lying in the dirt begging for his life. Brown then saw a Mexican soldier and slit his throat. Although Urrea reported that 42 Texans were killed, early 20th century historians generally only list 12 Texans as killed. Tejano involvement in the revolution had been notably absent from textbooks until the 1970s, so it is likely that historians were not including the Tejanos under Benavides. 6 Texans were taken prisoners. In defiance of the Tornel Decree, Urrea spared those who surrendered and sent them to a prison in Matamoros. Reports indicated that Urrea offered clemency after the intervention of Francita Alvarez, the mistress of one of Urrea's soldiers. 6 Texans escaped. 5 of those joined Fannin's garrison at Goliad and were later killed in the Goliad massacre. No reports of Mexican losses have been found, although at least one Mexican soldier is thought to have died. After the battle, Mexican soldiers rounded up the horses that the Texans had been herding and kept them. The battle marked the end of the Matamoros expedition. Although it occurred on the same day that Texas declared independence, Grant and his men did not know that they were fighting for the new Republic of Texas. According to historian Stephen Harding, the battle proved that the Texans did not fight well on open prairies. News of the battle reached Fannin on March 4th. Urrea's imminent arrival worried Fannin, who feared that Santa Anna would lead his troops from San Antonio de Béjar towards Goliad, essentially trapping Fannin and his men between the two branches of the Mexican army. Fannin wrote to the acting governor, James Robinson, and I quote, "I am a better judge of my military abilities than others, and if I am qualified to command an army, I have not found it out," end quote. The acting Texas government nonetheless left Fannin in charge of the fort at Goliad. They instructed him to determine whether it was best to make a retreat or make a stand. Fannin delayed making the decision, finally choosing to leave Goliad on March 19. Urrea's troops trapped Fannin's men on an open prairie, and the Texans surrendered after the Battle of Calito Creek. And most, including Fannin, were executed a week later in the Goliad Massacre. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.